Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues. My name is Juliane Campfield. I'm the director here at Deutsches Haus at NYU. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to a very special event tonight, Landscapes of Creative Destruction, Regenerating the Post-Industrial City. We are delighted to co-present this event with the Urban Democracy Lab. We've worked with them before, and hopefully we will work with them again in the not too distant future. Before we start, let me express my heartfelt gratitude to a few individuals and institutions. First of all, to my co-conspirator, Becky Amato, who is here in the first row. You can't hide. It's been a pleasure. Again, working with you, Becky is the Associate Director of the Urban Democracy Lab, and she's really done all the work for this event. I take no credit because we were so busy, and Becky took over and did almost everything, and I'm very grateful for that, and it's always a pleasure, and I enjoy our collaboration very much, which I think I've made pretty clear. So thank you. I'd like to thank our panelists, of course, for being here tonight, for coming here tonight, for traveling here tonight from Berlin and from Detroit and from other areas in New York. Thank you. We're thrilled to have you and delighted and grateful for your presence and look forward to your thoughts on this very topical theme. I'd like to thank the German Academic Exchange Service, the DAAD, for supporting our academic events here at Deutsches Haus. We couldn't do it without them, and we're very grateful for their continued and generous support. We also couldn't do it without my colleagues, Sarah, Hannah, our student workers, countless unpaid interns who work very hard behind the scenes to make all this happen. I'd also like to thank Laia and Isabel, our videographers. We are taping this event tonight, which you might have read on the door. If you don't feel comfortable with being taped, now is the time to leave. So anyway, so these are all the thanks. Thanks to you. At last, to the audience for coming here, for your interest in our cultural academic programs, and to those of you who study German here, thank you for studying here. For those of you who do not study German yet or do not speak it, you can learn German here. So, subtle hint. Our slogan goes, learn German if you dare, DER, more shameless self-promotion. Yeah. So before we start, one more thought, which just occurred to me when we were talking upstairs. I've always lived in cities, really big cities, and I've lived obviously in New York, but I also lived in Berlin, and we will talk about Berlin, we will talk about New York, we will also talk about Detroit, and I've never been to Detroit, and strangely in my head I have this title of a Robert Wilson piece that some of you might have seen in Berlin many years ago. It was Death, Destruction, and Detroit. It was an amazing theater that he did in performance in over 20 years in 3 parts. And so I've always thought of death and destruction in combination with Detroit. And I think now I will learn to think of Detroit in a new way. And I think it's very exciting what's happening there. It's very exciting what Robert is doing there. And some of you perhaps know it very well, and we will all know a little bit more about Detroit and the other cities, all the changes that are going on. When you have questions, or if you have questions, please wait until the official part here is over. We'll have a Q&A, and you'll have a chance to ask your questions then. Again, a reminder to everybody, the event is being taped, so when you ask your questions, please wait until you have the mic so that we do not lose your comment, your voice, your thoughts for the taping of our event. And now, finally, it is my great pleasure to welcome Becky Amato, and she will take over and introduce Gordon Douglas first, and then he will, in turn, introduce Eve Barron, Robert Elms, and Boris Forman, and then things will get really started. Thanks for your patience, and please join me in welcoming Becky and our other panelists. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Juliana, for that fabulous introduction. I have a very easy job of just introducing my colleague, Gordon, but also thanking all of you for coming and thanking Juliana and her staff for hosting us again this year, and all of our panelists for traveling, most of them, or half of them, from other places far and wide. So thanks again. So I'd like to introduce you to Gordon Douglas, who is our moderator this evening. He is my counterpart at the Institute for Public Knowledge. He's a postdoctoral fellow at and the associate director at the Institute for Public Knowledge at NYU. Multidisciplinary urbanist, Gordon's research explores connections between local cultural identity and urban political economy, with a focus on people's relationships to their physical surroundings in contexts ranging from gentrification to climate change. His forthcoming book, congratulations, concerns people who create unsanctioned but functional and civic-minded do-it-yourself streetscape contributions in their communities, and what these informal improvement efforts tell us about the persistence of privilege and inequality in urban space and participatory citizenship. His research, writing, and photography have been published in Urban Studies, City and Community, the Journal of Urban Design, Architect Magazine, Good, and in a handful of zines and blogs. Gordon received his PhD in sociology from the University of Chicago in 2014 and also holds degrees from the University of Southern California and the London School of Economics. So I turn it over to you now, Gordon, who speaks German, which is why he is doing the rest of this.
There's like one line of German in here.
All right, so I guess I'll introduce these guys in the order in which they're going to speak, which means I start with Bart Forman, who is a lecturer in political science and urban studies at Vrije Universiteit's John F. Kennedy Institute for North American Studies, and is an associated researcher at the, I'm going to try my French, Chaire de Recherche du Canada et Études Québécoises et Canadiennes at the University of Quebec. In Montreal. His research focuses on the relationship between urbanization and globalization, nationalism and political culture, and state-market relations. It draws from state theory and the fields of urban political economy, comparative political science, and North American studies. He's conducted research on urban planning strategies in North American global cities, social policies in the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom, and nationalism in North America and Europe. His publications include Zwischenalter und Neue Welt, Nation-Bildung im transatlantischen Raum, Global Port Cities in North America, Urbanization Processes and Global Production Networks, and the co-edited volume Quebec, Stadt und Gesellschaft, a 2015 handbook on policy and politics in the United States, which he co-edited with Christian Lamert and Marcus Sievert, is available online.
Thanks so much for being here. Thanks so much for having me. It's a great honor. Thank you, Juliane. Thank you, Sarah from the Deutsche Haus. Thank you, Becky. Thanks, Gianpaolo, who's not here tonight. So as I said, it's a great honor. It's a great pleasure to be here. I know I'm not the only person to say that he or she loves New York, but it's actually true. And if I could afford it, I would live here. But Berlin is pretty nice too. So what I'm responsible for is contributing the German accent to this panel, and I'll try my very best. Now, I think what my actual contribution, or what I hope my actual contribution to this panel is to sort of widen the debate a little bit on what we understand post-industrial cities to be and post-industrial urbanism to be. And one way we often think about post-industrial cities is as a moment of progress. So we have a notion of the post-industrial city as being both a state of affairs. We assume that certain cities have entered the post-industrial era. And at the same time, they are a vision of what future cities could be. And what we often assume implicitly when we're talking about post-industrial cities is that somehow they are harbingers of a better urban future. Right? They're more democratic, perhaps, maybe also more unequal, but they're also more sustainable, more diverse, more accessible, more open to its citizens. So there's an assumed hope for post-industrial cities to be better than their predecessors, the industrial past. And I'll talk a little bit about why I think this is the case. Now, I would like to use the 12 minutes that I have, and as a German, I'll try to be punctual, to make 3 points about this and to poke some holes into these visions of a better urban future, because I'm not sure they are warranted. And the first one is a little destructive, perhaps, and perhaps also a little harsh and anticlimactic. So the first point I really want to make is that we do not live in a post-industrial era. When we look at cities, to be sure, we can see how they are no longer, at least when we look at New York City, for example, or North Atlantic cities in Germany. Berlin is also a case, or Detroit is another case. We can see how warehouses are turned into lofts. We can see how working waterfronts have been developed into post-industrial esplanades. We can see how rail tracks become exciting and open parks. And within that sort of parochial view, it seems to us that we're entering a better urban era. And I think to see this transformation as some sort of progress is quite a plausible narrative. We contrast many times the corrupt, criminal urban past of the industrial era, the polluted urban past of the industrial era, and the undemocratic past of the industrial era with what seems to be open. And if you think, for example, of the waterfront as the prime example and perhaps the paradigmatic space where this transition from the industrial to the post-industrial happens, this is where we can really imagine this hard work, this polluted industrial context of the Fordist context, transiting into something new and hopefully more open and more accessible. So we have the hope that post-industrial waterfronts and other parks, post-industrial parks, somehow are the spaces where new public sphere comes to rise. Right? So if we tell these individual stories of individual places becoming better, I think this case for a post-industrial city can be made. But what we shouldn't forget is that we still need all the stuff that we used to need at the time. So we need, think of your iPhone, think of your iPad or Samsung computer, or think of your car, your Volkswagen perhaps, which might be a bit of a problem if you have one. Think of all these things that are produced elsewhere and that have disappeared from view. The production processes have lengthened, the supply chains have lengthened. They might not be, no longer be on the waterfronts of Manhattan or in Detroit City, but they have moved elsewhere. What that means, so basically when we're thinking of New York City as a post-industrial city, that might still be a convincing case. But when we think of the fact that labor, industrial labor, manufacturing labor has doubled globally, then we have a slightly different assumption and a different perception of what post-industrialism might mean. So from a global perspective, we're really not in a post-industrial era, but we are in a hyper-industrial era. Now, why should this be important? Why should we care about this? It might sound a little pedantic if I'm trying to make this case. But what's important is that we have reorganized society, we have reorganized economy on a planetary scale. And so when we're thinking about urbanization processes, we cannot just look at these individual places that are being regenerated or revitalized, but we have to think about these overall contexts and how costs have been shifted around globally. So if we overcome this sort of myopic view of the city as a separate place, if we overcome what my colleagues Hilary Angelo and David Waxmuth, who are also NYU alum, have called methodological cityism, so if we look beyond the city, we realize how these different economic processes are all bound into one another. And what we can observe from this perspective are massive cost shifts over time. Both historically, both at the present, and on different scales, on a global level, on a national level, and on a local level. So think, for example, globally of the way that environmental pollution is pushed into the oceans, away from the post-industrial waterfront, from these green spaces to other places. Think also of the exploitation in export processing zones, or think of the exploitation of shipping workers through flags of convenience or similar other types. At home, also think, of course, of the unbundling of the Fordist production system, which was possible precisely because of the building of an infrastructural regime that unbundled production processes on a global scale. And of course, in the cities. I mean, it's often forgotten. When I first lived here in New York City, it's often forgotten that New York City is the biggest port city on the East Coast. I didn't realize it at the time because all the port functions, all the logistics functions had moved away, opening up these waterfront places, moved away to Newark and to Brooklyn, and moved out of view. So, what I'm saying here is that the post-industrial islands that we see, such as the parks, such as the waterfronts, are not somehow harbingers of a better future, right? There is no such thing as a spatial trickle-down effect. These transitions in the post-industrial era are not just going to spread out across the city, but they are dependent on precisely what is absent from them. They're dependent on the logistics and the production processes elsewhere. This is important, I think, to understand. We're not looking at a global convergence where suddenly everybody becomes post-industrial and more democratic and greener and so on and so forth, but we're looking at an uneven development that is very uneven, both domestically and globally. Now, some have emphasized how post-industrial places might be kitsch or inauthentic. This is the discourse from the 80s and 90s. Some have said, well, the newer post-industrial places might be more interesting and more attractive. That's beside the point, is basically what I'm trying to say here. We have to look at these broader processes. Now, I want to make a third point before I conclude, and that is, what can we do about this? Should we just end up in some kind of a fatalism? And I think instead what we should do is to shift our perspective when we talk about cities and urbanization processes back from economic considerations to political considerations. Now, the title of this panel is Creative Destruction, the landscapes of creative destruction. And of course, it's a Schumpeterian term. Creative destruction is, and it implies the notion that technological innovation somehow magically changes economic structures, and we just have to endure these moments of rapid change, right? There is a technology that sort of falls from the sky, the market changes, has to change, and the state cannot intervene because it would distort the market or it would make what is a terrible process in the first place into a protracted, terrible process. So Schumpeter would say, step back, right? Let the market take over. When we think about all these processes in the post-industrial city that I was sort of pointing at, we can realize that the state, even in the liberal market context of the United States, even where we think there's an American exceptionalism and where the market is particularly big and the state is particularly small, even in this context, the state is at every corner. The state is or was important in the invention and the investments in transportation and communication technologies. Containerization couldn't have happened without the state. The types of computerization couldn't have happened without the state. So it's the Cold War context that is decisive here. But not just on the macro scale. The state is also key in processes when it comes to breaking up labor in the 1970s and 1980s, when it comes to the non-regulation of environmental pollution on the oceans, but also at home, when it comes to the subsidizing and incentivizing of investors in cities. So the state is everywhere. So the last point that I would really like to make is that we should acknowledge this presence of the state and hold it accountable for this is, rather than thinking, well, the market flows and ebbs, we should just endure them and cannot really do anything about it. So this is what I would like to contribute as a starter. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, up next is Robert Holmes, who founded the Galapagos Art Space in Williamsburg, Brooklyn in 1995. Galapagos became the key public venue that distilled the creative energy of the Williamsburg ethos into a single idea. An idea so strong that it attracted tens of thousands of participants to New York City and launched a record-breaking number of real estate development projects concentrated in and capitalizing on Williamsburg's success. The explosion of interest led Williamsburg to become an international destination for the arts and creative industries, driving cities around the world to study how it could be replicated at their own local governance levels. In 2008, following its success in Williamsburg, Galapagos Art Space moved to a location in Dumbo, Brooklyn. Through an innovative digital and scientific programming profile, along with its cultural and artistic programming, Galapagos played a key role in helping to rebrand the Dumbo neighborhood as a vital citywide destination for the cutting edge and the right now in smart, concentrated cultural opportunities. In 2015, Galapagos relocated to Detroit because, as Holmes explains, simply put, New York City has become too expensive to continue incubating young artists. Galapagos does not accept government grants or public funding in order to operate. Instead, it relies on a budget of 100% earned income. So Robert is going to talk to us, I guess, more about that. Yes. Thanks, Robert.
Thank you very much for having me. So the New York City has taken a very interesting course over the last 2 decades. I've was in New York City for 25 years. And New York went from being sort of a cultural aggregator of a best and brightest, if you will, sort of an American mecca, and I'm Canadian, so I say this with a little bit of an observer, bringing young artists especially and young thinkers to a certain point, to a place in the United States where they would then engage in a meritocracy of ideas. So if you're a young sculptor living in Austin or another city that you might have collected yourself into, like Portland or Minneapolis or Chapel Hill, these sort of aggregator cities that would bring young artists from a region into their more dense population, you would at times jump to New York and you would gain immeasurably from the anonymity and the sort of the ability to remake yourself whole over. And the United States needs this centralizing function, right? It's not enough to go to the regional capital because frankly, it's a little bit like still being in high school. People around you are similar and they're not dramatically different enough or offering you the anonymity that you frankly need to really, I think, engage and challenge yourself and your own ideas. New York became far too expensive, and the real estate boom that's here, that's evident if you walk the streets and look at the pricing on things. I mean, it's shocking. There's, I was looking at just on Zillow, a little real estate app, that there's nothing really for 20 blocks around here that's not over $5 million for sale at the moment. This is an incredible turn of events, and that white hot real estate market burned through affordable cultural habitat with a completeness and a thoroughness that I find absolutely shocking. So the American model doesn't offer any support for the smallest institutions, right? The ones that aggregate people just after the beginning and grow them up to the mid-career, which is the function of Galapagos. And what we found being in New York City was that we were frankly sort of running low on great ideas from young artists because they were bouncing off the perceived costs of arriving in New York City. And so they were staying in these other cities, that traditionally they would move from and come to New York City from. And it's, in my opinion, that the United States needs a mixing chamber, a sort of central cultural point where new ideas land, where things are challenged and where new models are created. And we literally went from an environment in Brooklyn where we were paying, I mean, it's not even an incredible amount of money in New York City, but we were paying $18,000 a month in rent, which for us was a huge challenge, right? So we slowly sort of moved the dial from mission over, towards business as much as we could. And then we decided that we weren't fulfilling what we needed to do as an organization and that we would seek somewhere else to do it. The question is, where is that place going to be, and what sort of zeitgeist does it match or align with? And there's a really interesting phenomenon in Detroit. So it's a city that has lost its industrial base, right? Detroit's everyone knows what's happened to Detroit. It's a common story at this point. But the city's lost its industrial base. Its middle class has largely moved from it. Its blue-collar class has fled the city in many ways, and it's gone from over 2 million down to in the 600,000s at this point. The region is 4.5 million people, and I think it was 2002 that was the first year that more people lived in cities than didn't, right? So this is sort of a UN moment of this is what has happened, and the city of Detroit offers really a sort of unique opportunity to really see the reurbanization of the United States, right? So there's a great interest in moving to downtowns. So this is something that Richard Florida wrote about in the 90s, and now we're seeing this, and from South Dakota to Texas, people are wanting to move back into downtowns, and I think that they're wanting to do that for a couple of reasons. One is to enhance their skill sharpening, right? So the economy doesn't promise you the same things that it promised you decades ago. It promises you that you have to keep on learning and adapting quickly. And it matches sort of an information age that allows dialogue and social interaction to fundamentally change, I think, how a city is going to grow. So in Detroit, we're often asked about gentrification, right? So this is the G word that, is a really furious word. There's so much anger that comes to this word, and there's so little dialogue that follows it. And in Detroit, we found a few things that are sort of very conservative and very progressive. And the key in Detroit, where you can buy a house for $10,000, if you don't like it, double your budget and go to 20 and then go to 40. It's incredibly inexpensive to buy there. The real question is home ownership. And if you can have everyone own their home, then everyone can rise, right? So now I come to dialogue. So in Philadelphia, there was a program to cap property tax rates at pre-gentrification levels because nobody gives you a raise because your neighborhood's doing great. And so people would often be sort of bumped out at the second phase of a tax assessment that they would drift up with their property to some degree and then be forced out because their taxes would be too high. And the dialogue in Detroit really centers around who's going to win and who's going to lose. And Detroit is a huge city where you can put Manhattan, Boston, San Francisco all inside of it, right? It's 140 square miles. It's a massive, massive place. And it doesn't suffer from the same constraints that New York City does, where you have to build up, right? So in this environment, there's a lot of solutions, I think, that can come forward to how is a new place going to be built. And I find it very interesting that in Detroit, everything from urban agriculture to fine arts is all part of the same sort of creative spectrum, right? So we're seeing it in Brooklyn, where I'm more familiar with, as sort of the artisanal movement, if you will. But there's a very interesting green shoots and sort of well springs of micro-manufacturing that are appearing in a city like Detroit. And there's a blue-collar ethos that really enables that to be part of the continuum from fine arts all the way back down to to building things. And I think it's a very interesting time to retemplate what a city is going to be, but it's also an interesting time because you're going to be asked quickly, what your contribution is and what your solutions are for things. And so I think that there's a nice sort of continuum of communication that happens quickly, and it's sort of truing the initiatives that people are taking on when they move to a city like Detroit or in other cities that are reindustrializing. And thank you very much for having me here.
All right, next is Eve Barron, who's an urban planner and educator with 15 years of New York City experience. She's worked in government as a land use planner, in advocacy as director of the Municipal Arts Society Planning Center, where she led the campaign for community-based planning, and as senior fellow for planning and policy at the Pratt Center for Community Development, where she co-authored the 2012 Brooklyn Navy Yard study. She's taught at Pratt Institute and at the City University of New York. She currently manages and teaches in the Urban and Community Studies program at the Joseph S. Murphy Institute, part of CUNY's School of Professional Studies. And Eve also works with the Collective for Community, Culture, and Environment, a woman-owned collective working on community-based planning projects, most recently as the lead on an affordable housing for zoning and land use for the plan for Chinatown and surrounding areas.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be on this panel tonight. It's exciting to be here. So we had the perspective from a scholar, from a business person, an artist. I think I'm here to provide the perspective as a kind of a practicing planner. And I'm definitely going to focus on New York City. You can probably tell from my bio that that's where my expertise lies. So I just want to get a sense of people here in the audience. How many of you are from New York City? Okay, quite a lot. How many of you have been here for at least 5 years? Okay, quite a lot. And how many of you have been here for less than a year? Okay, So we have a mixture, but quite a lot. So there's a lot of knowledge in this room about New York City, and I'm hoping I can capitalize on that a little bit, because I am going to be talking about some neighborhoods in New York City that you may or may not be familiar with. So, I think there is really no question that we are in a post-industrial economy. We have shifted, the brunt of our jobs from manufacturing to service and retail, and now iteratively, I think we're transitioning a lot of our jobs to the gig economy. So I think our service economy is even changing. There's a great deal of focus on high-tech post-industrial jobs and advanced manufacturing jobs, but I think there are really a lot of outstanding questions too about who those jobs are for. And as I was thinking through my remarks for this evening, I had a little bit of a tussle with the title of this panel, and that's around the issue of the post-industrial city. And this is where I want to say I agree with much of what Boris put forward, and I think what I'm going to do is try to bring that a little closer to the ground. So I think, as we can say that we're transitioning to a post-industrial economy, I'm not sure that we can say we're transitioning to a post-industrial city. And I think there may be some implications and limitations to even using that term to describe, or that label to describe what we're doing right now. Sorry for this fuzzy map. I did not create this one myself, but I just want to point out that in New York City, still about 15% of the land use is industrially zoned. This map shows you where our industrial areas are. They're in purple. The darker the purple, the heavier the manufacturing district that's represented. So you can see that we have some pretty substantial portions of our New York City waterfront that are devoted to industry, industrial-related uses, but also inland areas like East New York, Maspeth, Bushwick, and Jamaica. One of my colleagues has described industrial zones as sacrifice zones, and this is where we give over our land use to things that we don't really want to see. And this is something that you refer to, Boris. So this is where we like to hide things like scrap metal processing and cement plants and fuel generation, waste treatment, incinerators, bus depots, the infrastructure for transportation, and heavy industry. So these are some images from the one on the top left. That's an image from the South Bronx, where the South Bronx has been cut off from its waterfront from the Harlem River by the Oak Point rail line, which is a rail line that's devoted to one train trip per day. And the other image is from the CSX rail depot, also on the Harlem River. You may recognize the image on the left. If you ever ride the 7 train, that is Willets Point. That's devoted to auto-related uses, but is shifting over to a mixed-use development at the protestation of the existing businesses there. And the image on the right, that's the reconstruction of downtown Brooklyn. The trucks and the equipment that you see there are not generated in downtown Brooklyn. Those are coming from, primarily the industrial neighborhoods. So the city's industrial zones are primarily located adjacent to poor communities. And in these poor communities, it's primarily majority people who are Black, Latino, and Asian. Some of this is changing as real estate speculation causes displacement. There has been some transition in the demographics of these areas. But we are talking about areas like Sunset Park, Red Hook, South Side and Wallabout in northern Brooklyn, Stapleton in Staten Island, and Hunts Point in the Bronx. So this map is a little complicated, I know, and probably very hard to read, but this is from a website called Oasis, where it has a lot of data that you can layer. And the darker areas are census tracts where there are concentrations of communities of color. And you can see that in these areas, there are also a preponderance of environmental burdens. So these are things that range from brownfields to hazardous waste disposal sites to major air pollutions to combined sewer overflows. So I think the point to be made here is even though economically speaking we're in the state of post-industrialism, spatially we still have many of these industrial pockets, especially on the waterfront. And in these neighborhoods, it is the poor who are bearing the brunt of the public health burdens of industrial uses. And I think it's probably informative to talk about a few of those because, again, because these are areas that you don't see that often, we don't have to think too often about the burdens that are created here. So I'm really talking about heavy truck traffic that contributes to air pollution. I'm talking about particulate matter that comes from energy generation that can contribute to asthma. Transportation infrastructure that that encircles entire boroughs and cuts people off from their waterfronts and therefore opportunities for recreational activities. And industrial runoff, combined sewer overflow that contribute to water pollution. So both our industrial legacy, but also our industrial present are contributing to the vulnerabilities of our poorest communities. So they're bearing the public health burdens of our industry. And that, even though New York City has regulations to more equitably distribute these unwanted uses, like the city's fair share laws, those only address future uses that are being planned. They don't address uses that are already on the ground. So climate change is a new challenge for industrial areas and the communities next to them. Waterfront industries in certain areas use heavy metals and volatile chemicals in their production processes. So in events that invoke sea level rise, storm surge, or flooding, there's a real issue and a real concern about the release of these toxins into adjacent neighborhoods. And the city has just begun to look at this and hasn't gone very far, and that's where our environmental justice movement groups, like the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, are making headway to try to raise awareness of this. So to my mind, I have to question like post-industrial for whom, because I think we have so many communities that are really struggling with the industrial present. So there is this existing relationship among race, class, and industrial uses, and there are New York City is blessed in that we have so many community-based organizations that are working hard to fill in the gaps where government does not, to sustain investment in neighborhoods that government has shunned and the private market has shunned. And they are really doing the work on the ground to shift the power dynamic. So I really think that this post-industrial lens does not get at the industrial issues that communities are organizing around. So that's what I'm talking about when I say that I think there are constraints and limitations in the use of this term. So these neighborhoods are organizing around public health, environmental justice, transportation justice. But it's not, I want to make the point that it's not knee-jerk NIMBYism. It's not just like, I don't want these uses in my backyard. There's a much more complex understanding that, a lot of the jobs that come from these industrial areas are really, better paying than service or retail jobs. They're more stable. They have fewer barriers to entry. They're available to people with limited English proficiency and with lower levels of educational attainment. They're better paying in general than service or retail jobs. There are numerous examples of community organizing around public health issues that stem from our industrial past and present. This is just some examples. Just to highlight a few, a campaign to decommission an underutilized highway, a more fantastical but creative plan to put the Gowanus Expressway underground, to reuse the 135th Street Marine Transfer Station, which has been decommissioned by the city, but can become an asset for West Harlem. And the list goes on and on. But there are two very quick points that I want to make before I wrap up, because I know that time is short and I'm running out. Even if the industrial forms and our industrial zones evolve, and they probably will, because there are very smart people thinking about design and construction and architecture, and those functions will evolve, but we still are going to have industrial areas for a long time. The city has put out a series of 6 what they call significant maritime industrial areas, with concomitant commitments to not rezoning them, because they are so important to the industrial functioning of our city. And we need to keep these areas intact, because as Boris pointed out, you still need to have these things in your city. New York State demands that New York City be responsible for 80% of its energy generation. We need places to process our garbage. We need places to make things, so we don't have heavy truck flow in and out of the city. So it's important to keep these intact. But as we think about this regeneration of landscapes as we move into the post-industrial realm, I think we really need to prioritize the regeneration of public health for all of our communities. And that really begins with not just giving a seat at the table to industrially impacted communities, but actually allowing them to and inviting them to lead the conversation. So that's where I'll leave it off.
All right, thank you guys so much. So I came in here sort of cold. That was I didn't know what these folks were going to talk about, and it really, I think it all links together really wonderfully. And it's neat to see how we have come in to a conversation on the post-industrial city and really kind of torn that whole idea apart, despite the fact that it is one of the more central parts of the urban studies discourse, and has been since the 1970s, if not earlier. And so I think it's just been a lot of really generative ideas here that really connect in a lot of interesting ways, despite the fact that say Boris, for instance, started by telling us we're not in a post-industrial city altogether. And I think, I guess I want to start I'm going to keep my remarks really brief and just ask a question or two. But I think that in raising this Schumpeter connection that is implicit or explicit in the title of the event tonight, excuse me, it really makes clear the sort of neoliberal, to use an overused term, aspect of this post-industrial city making as it happens in different contexts. And so, we have these sort of green spaces and these post-industrial amenities that Boris mentioned. And the waterfront becoming a new amenity as a very positive sort of byproduct of this post-industrial space. And yet, as Boris points out, those are very unique sort of spot-by-spot places where we can see that story playing out in a way that we're all very excited to see, right? We get a new park, or maybe we just get a new condo development, but either way, theoretically it's better than an empty warehouse. Whether or not it's better than manufacturing jobs is another question. But we can see just how limited, the whole argument of Schumpeter is that we need to, as you said, sort of step back and let these things happen, and of course there will be this sort of technologically created unemployment, but there'll be new jobs, and that's how we produce innovation and grow the economy, even if it's at the expense of the prior technological worker, the prior technologies worker. And of course we see that so explicitly when we look at the the maps and the kind of hard data on how New York City is living in its post-industrial era, where of course we still have these industrial areas, and how one of the things that they're most marked by is the fact that they have the negative consequences of industry are still so very much present, and in fact, kind of ironically, perhaps for the people who most needed the sort of manufacturing jobs or could most benefit from higher paying, stable jobs of that more Fordist variety. And then I think as a result, we can see just how different, how many different meanings some term like gentrification actually has, whether we're talking about not just New York versus Detroit, where these mean very different things. And of course, a part of that story is Robert's work in Williamsburg, which, as we read in the bio, right, it was part of making that scene that made Williamsburg what it is today, right? And made Dumbo what it is today, one of the most expensive neighborhoods in the city, and was, of course, your own sort of, not undoing, but displacement to Detroit, right? And yet, again, these things mean such different, something like gentrification has a very different meaning whether we're talking about a residential neighborhood or an industrial neighborhood. And of course, there's a great deal of new concern about industrial gentrification in many of these waterfront neighborhoods in New York, where we're concerned about preserving the remaining industrial jobs that we still have. And yet again, of course, the concern has to be about the environmental impacts of these kinds of things, because any industrial, or at least manufacturing stuff that's going to continue beyond the sort of light manufacturing of the artisanal economy is at the very least going to involve trucks and all these other sorts of things that lead to strong correlations with asthma and what have you in the surrounding neighborhoods. And so then I guess I would sort of end by talking about the hope for this kind of continued industrial spaces in cities and what we want out of that. And I guess the question that I have is for all of you really, is the extent to which there's a policy obligation to try to preserve industrial spaces, the extent to which we think that they are good. And we can define that in all sorts of ways. I mean, because it might include the very small manufacturing spaces and the small art spaces as sites of production. But then, of course, whether or not those places are creating jobs at any meaningful scale is a hugely important one. So I wonder if you guys could talk about we could call it policy implications, I suppose, or policy obligations for a city like New York, and perhaps also for a city like Detroit, in terms of how to promote those things and what really ought to be promoted, if we can acknowledge, of course, that some aspects of this stuff are very bad. And we are living in a very different economy. So what can we do?
Should I just say one word or two? Because I find it interesting also from a German perspective that there seems to be a certain fetishism of manufacturing jobs here. And I mean, Obama has been talking about it quite often in the State of the Union addresses. The whole discussion of a green economy is, of course, part of this dynamic. But what I think is often forgotten is that it's not the manufacturing job as such that is so attractive and so appealing to many people. In fact, I mean, when we think back to the first manufacturing jobs and the first industries, when we think back to all the way to Adam Smith, he was emphasizing the stupidity of many of these jobs, the repetitiveness and the exploitation of the mind, etc. And so people had to be forced into this kind of labor. What we forget is that what I think people find attractive about manufacturing jobs is the type of social conditions and the type of standards that went with it in this type of Fordist compromise. So what I was trying to point out is that we should exactly be talking about these kind of political decisions of flexibilizing work, you know, of pulling down certain standards that gets forgotten if we only think about manufacturing, right? It doesn't really matter. People could also organize in service sector jobs. There are certain reasons why they don't as much as they used to in the manufacturing context, but this is a different discussion to have. One more point, because I was really impressed also with what Yves said about the basically the costs of the maybe not so post-industrial world. And that was the social gradient in health, that we see that certain underprivileged communities are also the ones that are bearing the brunt of these costs that are produced in societies. And what I did in my research was to compare this kind of social gradient in health in the American context, the US-American context, and the Canadian context. And it turns out that we see a similar correlation between low income and poor environmental standards in Canadian cities, but we don't have the same correlation with racial factors. So in the US, often it's racial minorities at the same time, whereas in Canada, it's just a question of class. Yeah.
I think it's really important for governments to, by policy, direct what it is that they're wanting to achieve. So I think that there's a democratization that's happening that's very important to look at. So the conditions that we see in cities, I think it's really important to have mixed use inside of a city, but it's very important to move the pollution away, right? So you can't burn coal anymore to make your electricity, right? But you can have manufacturing inside of a mixed use environment where you're putting ideas and people to work in a place that produces things in a clean way. The city is about to change, frankly. It was a shame when Bloomberg wanted to do the taxis as hybrids or electric cars, and that was beaten back, right? So Norway and Denmark have agreed that they're not going to be selling any more gasoline or diesel cars after 2025. That's a fantastic achievement. I mean, it seems like just common sense, but it's a great achievement. And when we think about 3D printing and we think about the materials that you can close a loop on, so you can recycle your plastic into a thing that grinds it and then makes it into the string essentially for a 3D printer. There's all kinds of ways that you can move recycling and environmentalism into the manufacturing process of things that happen in your city. And I'm really excited to be in Detroit to see that happen. Detroit still has all the infrastructure, all the railheads, all the highways, everything that it used to transport millions and millions of cars back to the rest of the country. And it'd be interesting to see how it's sort of put back into use as micro-manufacturing and arts and creative things are what rejuvenate the city. But it's very difficult now to put something in a city without encountering fierce opposition. And so we end up with, in New York City, fair distribution of laws that promote the fair distribution of polluting areas or polluting items, right? So there's a lot of social movement quickly. We're seeing it in politics. People are very upset with the way politics has been run. We're seeing it in Black Lives Matter. People are able to demonstrate and able to aggregate their own voices and their collectivity to adapting to change. And I think we're just on the cusp of this. I mean, there was a labor movement, and then we went into the environmental movement in the beginning of the 70s, and then there was sort of the not in my backyard or in my backyard, things that happen. But we're really at the beginning, I think, of sort of a new organization of how we democratize and demonstrate our governance of cities. And I think that's a really exciting thing. And I would just go back again to the no petroleum, no diesel cars in Norway and in Denmark. That's a really exciting thing to have in your city, and we should be quickly adopting those things here.
Yeah, I mean, I think New York City has taken great strides, actually, to try to protect some of the industrial areas. But there, especially under this particular mayor, there's new legislation that will give a little bit more teeth to the enforcement of some of the uses that start to erode manufacturing zones, like storage units and hotels. And I think when I was talking about the campaigns around that are coming out of the communities that are impacted by industrial uses, they're Uprose in particular is a community group in Sunset Park in Brooklyn, and they both have a campaign to preserve the working waterfront, as well as a campaign to transition to low emission fuels. So I think they see no inconsistency in that. They're doing both at the same time, and I think that is what we need to push for, is more environmental management systems that go into our production cycles, so that we can get to a point where the uses aren't as toxic.
It's tough though, right? Because to use the Sunset Park example, a big part of that plan is to sort of recreate, the Navy Yard Sunset Park, right? But on your map of where there's still industrial activity happening, the Navy Yard looks pretty quiet, right? Because it's still, I mean, it's at this point it's a huge wide variety of other uses, some of which may or may not be light manufacturing, but it shows up there as much more an indication of the sort of contemporary artisanal craft economy, not of the manufacturing economy that would preserve jobs in Sunset Park. So I think that seems to me a real challenge for how we would preserve, those districts in Sunset Park. And of course, people would love to have another Navy Yard because it's a better neighbor than a factory or something like that. I mean, I don't have the answer, but I'd be curious to know how that really gets hashed out among a community group, within a community group like Uprose, and how they would prioritize those really difficult concerns.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you a little bit about the Navy Yard model, and you're absolutely right about its success is predicated on the fact that it provides flexible space. I mean, its success really comes from the fact that industrial spaces are getting more and more expensive and harder to find. So, they have a waiting list of like a year and a half for companies that want to locate in the Navy Yard because they've been priced out of Williamsburg, they've been priced out of Jamaica, so they're coming to the Navy Yard because the rents are lower. They've been able to provide that space because they're flexible. If they don't have, they have a variety of uses and a variety of building types so that they can have a mix, and so they can replace tenants flexibly. That model for Industry City in Sunset Park is certainly something that the city is looking at, and the push is for. The jobs issue is one thing, but I think it's the use issue really and it's the kind of speculation impacts that that groups are concerned about. The artisanal uses generate a quality of life that is somewhat different from the existing communities, and it is kind of like an antecedent of gentrification, and that's the concern.
So I just wanted to ask also finally then, Robert, to maybe talk a little more about Detroit, and then after that maybe for Boris to talk a little bit more about the German context, even though I know you're a North Americanist. Is the future of Detroit one in which any sort of industry in this sense that we've been talking about comes back to that city and it returns to any of its sort of the organization or conceptualization of that city, or is it kind of forever now moving forward in some new, very different, perhaps arts, crafts, service, and perhaps even urban agriculture, these other things people talk about in Detroit a lot? Is that sort of the future of the place, or can you see a city that looks anything like, of course it would be different industries, but is there a Schumpeterian sort of return of employment and industry to Detroit? And then I guess after that, Boris, if you talk a little bit more about some of the stuff you started to raise in contrast to the manufacturing emphasis here in Germany.
Well, we see in Detroit, there's a lot of talk about when products have more and more technology in them, that there's a reshoring. Right, so you don't necessarily want to give your IP out to China or to another country, but you want to actually build it in the United States so you can protect the system that's incorporating your own technology within it and not having it be knocked off quickly. So GE has brought back ovens, for example. I mean, it seems like a pedestrian example, but they're building them largely robotic, but they're also employing people when they bring that back, so there's net job gain. But I think, in Detroit it's very interesting because the middle class, the black and the white middle class, have both left the city in large part, and they've gone out to these other counties, and they are other municipalities and other jurisdictions. And so you're left with a very poor city that votes, right? It's very organized. It's based on the churches. It's based on its social environments that really, in many cases, do go around the churches. And the church community is very active politically. And so people are voting for food security. These issues are issues where people feel empowered to make a comment and to elect a leader who is wanting to engage that conversation. I think we're seeing that more and more. And so the urban ag is, sort of what do we do with all this space that's in Detroit, right? So people talk about the prairie coming and advancing in on the city, and this is 100% true. You see it. I mean, there's, a house that we're looking at in a neighborhood, it's $160,000, and in Detroit, that's an expensive house. And, and just having come from New York City, it's a shockingly affordable number. It's cheaper to buy a house in Detroit than it is to rent a house. I mean, this is fantastic. And it's so encouraging. But there's pheasants in the area. There's rabbits in the area. And these are because the vacant lots are enough that there's a tapestry of sort of a thoroughfare and animals can move around. It's not necessarily going to stay like that, but the pressures on the real estate environment mean that it won't grow with an increased density. We'll sort of see the same patterning of environments that can go out into the borders of the 140 square miles of the city. But within that, you get to have urban agriculture, and you get to have fine artists, and you get to have everything that's in between, the 3D printing environments and the micro-manufacturing and the incubators. Everyone's struggling now for what the model is going to be going forward, but the model, I think, is very exciting, and it's very democratic. Do we gain too model? So communities are asking, do we gain? We can't put that polluting element inside of our neighborhood. That's the environmental justice isn't being served by doing that. So there's a lot of empowerment that's coming up, and I think because Detroit starts, frankly, from such a low economic place, that all of those things coming together will be able to express in a very full spectrum what the future and what the possibilities of urban growth can be.
Yeah, Berlin also used to be shockingly affordable, but part of the reason why it's not anymore, I think, is also related to, some attributed to artists. There's certainly a certain authenticity to Berlin that has been attracting people, also a certain incompleteness of the city. And a rough charm that has attracted people. And of course, the politics that have been moving the capital from Bonn to Berlin was an important impact. I'm not going to lay out the entire tableau of how Berlin became what it became, but what's important to bear in mind is that there has also been a similar gold rush feeling in the 90s and 2000s, and one of the important aspects of that, which we haven't been talking about too much yet, is of course the process of displacement. Rents have been exploding over the last couple of years. I sort of have an insight into the artist milieu because my brother is one of the many artists in Berlin, and I see his community sort of disintegrating and moving to other places because they can no longer afford to live in Berlin. So I think Berlin sort of building, closing all empty places, empty spaces that used to make it so attractive is one aspect of it. So there might be an aesthetic argument to make, but I think the more important one is one of displacement. Who can really afford to live within the Ringbahn? If you have been to Berlin, that's all the parts that are more or less part of the city center, and less people can afford to do so.
I had a question for Robert. How do you think the level of higher education in Detroit will play into its development? Pretty much most of the post-industrial cities, the ones that I'm aware of at least, are partially fueled by a school that has a huge influx of young and creative talent to the city each year. Like alone, NYU has 50,000 students, and there's probably each given year 300,000 to 400,000 students within the whole entire New York City. Even though Detroit does have Wayne State, Detroit Mercy, DIA, and UMichigan in Ann Arbor, which is kind of in Detroit. How do you think that its lack of premier universities will play into its development? And especially how you said in bringing young talent to the city, how do you think that'll impact it?
Well, I think the question for Detroit right now is recruitment and retention for the industries that are driving its success, its current success. And there's an idea to sort of regionalize Ann Arbor and Cranbrook Academy of Art, sort of moving the map that it would include those areas that those places are in. The city does suffer from a lack of skilled workers. Michigan itself complains consistently at the state government level that it doesn't have the skilled technicians to operate the things that it needs to operate to make its industrial economy move forward. So, there's this idea that, welders, we don't have enough welders, right? So in Detroit, at least, this is not just about Detroit, but there's sort of a, it's become a meme, if you will, about the lack of skilled training, and should we move to a vocational base or to a higher ed base? What is the new economy going forward going to require of people at all different levels? And Detroit, fortunately, has just really incredible amounts of land. It's a place that can just go forever in so many ways. But the EDUs, the eds and the meds that are in Detroit and the foundation community are outsized for the footprint of the city. And they require, brain capital that needs to come to the city. And so there's I think a look at how the arts and how a creative environment can thrive and help recruit and retain people into those environments and make the city competitive. So there's sort of a bundling, if you will, of all of those things together. But the economy clearly, in terms of manufacturing, is going towards an ideas-based economy, right? So it's breaking down even further, to the maker bot. For example, the printing, the bot universe. What is it called? There's a Thingiverse, right? So the Thingiverse is sort of the 3D printing environment where you can upload your own things or download things, then print them and use them. And then there'll be sort of a royalty environment that moves in with that. But the EDUs are going to play a huge role in Detroit. And I think regionalizing all that together is can have a big impact there.
So I also have a question, Robert, for you about the sort of specific geography of Detroit, which is that you've been talking a lot about how the size of Detroit is a great opportunity. At the same time, Detroit not only has to scale down because of population loss, but there's also the argument that it should scale down because it's based on a really low-lying model that's very dispersed and sort of comes from a mixture of suburban and industrial land use. So I'm wondering a little bit about how maybe this post-industrial landscape can provide some answers for how a city can actually embrace density after many generations of having a non-dense formation.
It took a long time to figure out in Detroit, as a New Yorker, who walks, right? So we walk everywhere in New York City, and today I looked at my iPhone and I'd done 7 miles, and I never walk around in Detroit. And it took forever to figure out that the highway map in the city, the one that if you got, map of Detroit, you would see these 2 highways coming down and 2 highways going across. And that's their subway map. They think about transporting themselves through roadways and through automobiles. And so I think if you green them, then you can have a regionalism that's going to work. If you're doing it on petroleum and diesel and you're polluting in other ways, then you end up with asthma and all kinds of bad results. But the land use in Detroit, there's a tree farm in Detroit. There's a very large green swale project, which is taking, I think it's a 6-acre Ford factory parking lot and taking all the rainwater off of it. So it's moving this sort of blue infrastructure, into an area where it's collected and then is used to irrigate a green area around it. But it's also taking it off of the storm overflow because it's a combined sewer like New York City. And so the EPA is requiring Detroit, like New York City was required, to either get the volume down or build a treatment plant for it. So Detroit is looking for ways to do that. Maybe I strayed from your question, but that was a good question.
I had a question. I think it's something that you guys have touched on a little bit, but I think I'm interested in this relationship of the kind of post-industrial to the idea of like a post-carbon. And that's something that I think you talked a little bit about, like there's this hope and this potential for like what we see when we see green uses of the city and kind of like these healthier potential of like what a post-carbon city could look like. But on the other hand, you talked about this kind of like myth of it, like it looks nicer for us here, but it's not a post-carbon, it's just we've moved it. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about kind of maybe that potential or the myth or limitations of that and what you guys see as that aspect of the post-industrial landscape in the future.
I'm very glad you asked that question because it shows me that some of the things that were perhaps a little incoherent, because in Germany it's 2 o'clock at night, and I have a newborn that normally keeps me awake at night, so I would be doing other things at the moment, and it shows me that some of that came across. So I'm glad about this. But the post-carbon economy, yes, there is a certain hope for technological innovation to solve the problems of cities. That's one narrative that we see. People talk about smart cities and big data, and if we get better algorithms, we will be able to calculate flows better, and therefore we will be more efficient in the kind of ways we allocate resources. That's one hope. There's another hope that if we beautify the city, then somehow it will be better, right? More open. That was more what I was talking about. The point that I was trying to make is that this type of narrative comes up now and again every time that we have a shift from a certain economic structure to another. If you think back to the late 19th century, there was a similar shift from a steel-based economy to one of Fordism, an auto-based economy, and there too you have two narratives coming up. The city beautiful movement that says, wait, hey, hold on, industrialization has been taken too far. We have to make cities cleaner and greener for everybody. And the city efficient movement that is saying, well, hold on, we have to organize our flows more efficiently. We have to reorganize our governance institutions. Pretty much the same debates we're having now 100 years later, basically. What happened at the time and what I'm afraid of will happen again is that when we have these two debates on the beautiful city and the efficient city, is that we forget the question about social justice and inequalities, because that is sort of dropped under the table. And yeah, so the patchwork that we see also when we just look at individual separate greening spaces might also distract us from the big questions. If you think of transportation on a global scale, it's running on bunker fuels. The shipping industry is the most polluting industry in the world. 15 container ships, the 15 biggest container ships, produce as much pollution as all of the cars in the world together at the same time. And we're not talking about it because it's a hidden industry, basically, right? So I'm not trying to draw a conspiracy theory, but these are processes that we don't reflect much. And yeah.
I was thinking about Berlin and Detroit. I was wondering what your opinion there is. Berlin was totally destroyed. There was so much land, people were gone, and now there's a tremendous amount of building. Have they done a good job, or how can it be compared to Detroit?
One of the parallels, of course, is that many New York City artists are coming either to Berlin or to Detroit. So there seems to be a similar dynamic here, and mostly, as Robert mentioned, of course, because of real estate prices and rents that people can no longer afford. Have they done a good job? I mean, the question is always a good job for whom? Who benefited from these kinds of development and who lost? I mean, for students, you can have a great life in Berlin. Rents are still pretty low if you compare them to London or Paris or New York City. The infrastructure is great. The public transportation is fantastic. I mean, there are a lot of things that we benefit from. But at the same time, I was trying to indicate that there are processes of displacement happening, and not just for artists who can no longer afford to live in those spaces or to work in those spaces, which are being replaced by hotels and other places, but of course also to Turkish or populations with Turkish backgrounds who are pushed outside the city and whom we forget in the process. So it depends on who you ask if it's a success story or not.
And thank you so much as well for a lovely panel tonight. From the position of a layperson, I'd love to hear how a city thinks about this displacement question. Are you giving preference to a certain vision, New York 2020, or is there a conversation, a dialogue about who is coming in, who is going out, and how do you think about that? In the case of New York, in the case of Detroit, I know these are specific cases. I wonder if we can abstract that to a global, general context.
I think the flaw in all of displacement is who owns the property. And so Detroit has a unique opportunity where the citizens can own the property, right? So if the house is $20,000 or $30,000 and it functions as a house, it has heating, it has water, it has electricity, it functions as a house. If you own the house, Michigan has a rather perverse property tax arrangement. So property taxes can only go up by 3% or the rate of inflation, whichever is higher. And that was an attempt by conservative politicians to strangle cities, right? To cut their funding so that the cities don't support, or that the state doesn't support the city in any way and balances its own books because it just doesn't transfer capital in the way that it used to. But what that means is if you buy a house in Detroit right now, it's taxed forever at your initial basis, and it can only rise by 3% per year. So if everyone can simply, and it's not to be utopic to say if only everyone could own their own home, but you know the moment in Detroit is the more people that you can get to own their own home, and let's say we sort of utopically abolished renting and everyone owned, then there theoretically is no displacement at that point. The Great Lakes region has 25% of all the world's fresh water and has a whole bunch of empty cities that ring it. And so there's really, I think, a very interesting area for a laboratory for this sort of social consciousness and policy debate.
But then with owning your own homes, there's also less mobility. So like the very reason these changes happen and these new cities develop is because people do move. If people never move, then like that's kind of a dystopia, not a utopia. What's your thought on like the whole?
If you owned, say I owned my home in New York City, back in the 90s, I would have a lot of options now. If I could have bought the building, except that, yeah. So maybe if you can trade laterally, if your house in Detroit becomes worth $100,000, or $200,000, then you can just sort of move laterally to Milwaukee, and trade one for one, in some way. But where we have these giant spikes of difference, like New York City, I mean, it's almost the change and adaptation can't happen here. It's a strange place to think about change and adaptation because it's so twisting, And then you go to Detroit and you sit there for 6 months and you work and time feels very different. And you can grow ideas in a different way because you're not sort of furiously running to find out you're in the same spot. Life is very different there, and it's the amount of time I think really engenders the creation of ideas and then the collaboration of speaking about them and then the execution. How does one execute them? And in New York, there's no time to talk about it. So.
I just wanted to ask, who do you think benefits the most from this post-industrial redevelopment and regeneration, and what could be done to make that more equitable? I think about some of the comments that are made, and I think about owning property, and that's really out of the range of most low-income people here in New York or even in Detroit. So framing that as part of the question a little bit.
So, I mean, I can speak to the situation a little bit in New York City. I think it's pretty clear if we look at what's going on in the waterfront neighborhoods that have been rezoned that who is benefiting primarily from post-industrialism is, people who own large parcels of property, developers, kind of the real estate industry that supports those uses, and increasingly, global investors. There's more and more indication that a lot of real estate speculation is fueled by global investment. So we can't detach what's going on in New York City's economy from what's going on elsewhere. If you don't mind, I'm going to take the time to return to this issue of displacement for just a moment, and then maybe someone else will respond. Because I think the person who asked the question about displacement has landed on the key issue within the broader spectrum of gentrification. The real issue is displacement, and it is increasingly the number one problem in New York City, primarily for residences, but also for businesses. I just want to implicate as broad a role as possible for policy in tackling the issue of displacement. I mean, we have a mayor who has a plan for affordable housing, but the plan is predicated on rezonings and kind of collateral from private investment and private real estate development. So we don't have any good tools to really like staunch real estate speculation in New York City. People are working at the margins on things like community land trusts, but those are very small and incremental steps. So what what government really needs to step in and do is address this, like kind of rapacious activities of landlords who are pushing tenants out, and this, the very rapid erosion of rent regulations that protect, our existing affordable properties, and luxury decontrol. So, I think that there is an enormous role for policymakers to address just the issues you're talking about.
Yeah, so I think that's an important question. Who benefits from the shift from what was called a goods-producing society to a goods-moving society, where stuff is no longer produced here or only in parts? And I think we could give a couple of answers. I mean, the shippers, big box stores, big retailers were the big benefactors from this perspective. And others, I mean, if we're thinking about inequalities, there are certain dynamics which have strengthened these this drifting apart of society in the US. And they're related to globalization, as the New York Times tells us today, and I was surprised to see an economist actually making this point. But I want to make another point, which is one related to what Robert Reich wrote in, I think, 2007 in his book Super Capitalism, which is that consumers also benefited. We also benefited from cheap prices. And there's a reason why neoliberalism, if I want to use the term again, stuck, because we all benefit to a certain degree. The problem is that we're shooting ourselves in the leg while we're doing it, right? Because we're we can shop more cheaply, but at the same time we're also undermining our own labor standards and all these different things. So what we do is basically also, if we buy a house somewhere as individuals, that might be a strategy. But what we're basically doing is to play a divide and conquer game. And what I was trying to say in my remarks was we should look at the public good and the public interest, and we need to formulate it as a group, so to speak, or as different types of groups rather than individuals, because otherwise we will always again and again fall into these divide and conquer logics.
So Detroit is trying to figure out how to move the ability to purchase a home from a bank environment, which is about $80,000 before a bank will touch a house, because they can't make enough money on the house over time to make the transaction viable. The city is doing a program called Detroit Home Ownership, or part of the Detroit Land Bank. And what it is, it's a combination of sort of a FHA loan, which is 3% fixed rates over 30 years with a 3% down payment. And they're moving the bar of ownership lower and lower and lower, and they're at about $30,000. So politically in Detroit, you need to push that even lower to get reelected. So the Mayor Dugan, I think, is doing a really interesting job of figuring out how you can move renters into owners, because they often pay less when they own. And the programs and the innovations between the Obama administration and Detroit's had a lot of sort of special help from blight removal, et cetera, from the federal government. And there's a good level of communication. And so this recent program, which is going to leverage about $100 million of equity, is designed to keep pushing lower and lower on who can afford to buy a home. And really, if you convert everybody into owners, I think you're really doing them a service. And then if the city improves, then their position improves, and maybe they get to put their kids through school for it. But they're not just sort of, you can't displace them if they're an owner. And if you cap the property tax increase on what they actually own, and as a result of that process, then they're immovable. And then they engage in politics. Homeowners engage in politics much more than renters, et cetera. There's all kinds of knock-on benefits that follow that.
I have two questions, one for you, Boris, and one for you, Robert. Earlier on, you hinted at the repercussions for example, the German-Turkish community in Berlin to be, pushed to the periphery or beyond. And I'm just wondering now, with the refugee crisis, I'm not quite sure if crisis is the right word, but let's call it crisis, the repercussions that will affect the refugees and the, previous inhabitants of German cities, especially when you think, for example, of cities like Munich with incredibly high rents, and with Berlin's rents increasing, and a whole new group of people coming in there who have pretty much nothing. Like, what kind of effects does that have on the infrastructure of the rental market or accommodations, and also how do policymakers respond to that? I'd be curious about that. And the question for you, Robert, when you decided to give up New York, so to speak, to look at it from a negative, and then go to Detroit, and I know at some point you had been also thinking of potentially moving to Berlin. I'm just curious about your decision process of choosing Detroit. Of course, there are very good reasons, but I'm just curious if you could share that with us, like your trajectory to that place.
Well, that's a very important issue, the refugee, if you want to call it crisis or not. I mean, it has become a crisis for the political system in Germany. There has been a radical shift in political discourse in Germany. Many things that were taboos, and for good reasons taboos since the Second World War, have become speakable again in the German political discourse. And there's been a drastic shift towards the right, which we can also observe elsewhere. I mean, the polarized system here in the US, but also in France and across Europe, we can see similar developments. And just as a parenthesis, I think this is related to the inevitability and Alternativlosigkeit, to learn a German, to use a German term, Alternativlosigkeit, so the lack of an alternative of the third way. So I think that this polarization in part is the realization that what was preached to us, the inevitable success of globalization, somehow doesn't hold its promise. And so there is this movement which we see across many places. How about refugees? Well, for the moment, they're basically being put out of view. If you live in Berlin, you don't really see refugees, or you wouldn't know if you did. I think it's slightly different in Munich, where the housing is more also within the city, but there was just an article today in the Zeit about this particular problem, that many of the refugees are being placed within Munich, which was one of the most expensive real estate markets in Germany, and people don't really know how to deal with it. So it's very explosive, and it will remain so. And the big danger that I see is one which we see also play out in France now, which is the long-term problem of building enclaves and ghettoizing certain populations, and excluding them from a certain type of upward mobility and certain promises of participating in a society that make these dynamics of polarization and of societal falling apart even stronger and more dangerous.
As a Canadian, we feel very separate from the United States. We feel like we're halfway between Europe and the United States, right? And so we sort of take an observer position. And most of my friends in Williamsburg were Europeans. Some were Americans, but we would have dinners where there were 20 people and there could be 4 Americans at the table. And as New York for us got more and more expensive, the value of New York, to me, sort of had a heartache for the value of New York, and for all the things that I was able to learn here, and frankly, therefore the gifts that I was able to receive from it. And the idea to go to Berlin was, to go to a more advanced social environment that was more akin to Canada, for me. And I thought maybe there'd be more stability inside of that. And ultimately, that I think what grew correspondingly was the idea that in New York City, this aggregation of ideas that would then sort of, New York produces ideas, and it doesn't win because it has bike trails and running paths. It competes with culture. And where sort of California would send skateboards one way, New York would send ideas back the other way. And if that's going to be displaced, I think there was a little bit of a sense of mission that it needs to be replicated somewhere in the United States. And so there was the idea that Detroit could be that place, and that you need to bundle artists together so that they feel empowered and that they feel like they can participate politically and be active, as opposed to being just bouncing off New York and being dispersed around the country. I think there's a huge value in bringing them together. So that's ultimately, as I get older, everyone, as we get older, we want to sort of give back. So I think there was a sense of responsibility to stay in the United States and do that work.
So throughout the, I suppose, 20th century, we saw a lot of very big projects in New York, such as the Mid-Manhattan Expressway and Stuytown. I'm wondering if there are similar such developments in conversation today for the future of the city. I suppose this is specifically for Eve.
Fortunately, I don't think that we're going to have any additional highways that cross-cut Manhattan. So I think we're safe from there. There's been a lot of press around the city's third water main, which is an enormous undertaking to replace some of the aging infrastructure for water delivery from the Catskills. And that is a project that's been going on for about 30 years, and apparently there's been a hold on its completion, but when that is an enormous undertaking. The Second Avenue subway is a big piece of what's happening, and it's proceeding very slowly, and it's starting right up near where the mayor lives, and working its way southward, and it's going to take a long time. I think the completion of the city's plans for Hudson Yards is going to be enormous. It's going to add a neighborhood that is the size of my own hometown, which is like about 35,000 people. And we also have Atlantic Yards being built out right now, which will house about an equal number of people. I think the thing to keep an eye on right now, frankly, is the growth of downtown Brooklyn. When the city rezoned it back in, I think it was 2004, the idea was it would grow as a commercial area that would compete with Midtown for Class A office space. But what has resulted is residential towers. So and that's happening really fast, and it's not stopping. So I think that you're going to see like an enormous transformation of downtown Brooklyn and the adjacent neighborhoods.
Thank you so much. Thanks for coming. Thank you guys. Thank you, Gordon, Eve, Robert, and Boris, for a tremendously interesting, insightful panel. And please all have a glass of wine and continue the dialogue. Thank you.